All right, being respectful of everyone's time, I think we'll go ahead and get rolling. Welcome to another session of ADA Pathways awardee presentations. We have two fabulous lectures today, both very translational, but I think translational in different ways. And I'll let the stories unfold themselves, and you'll understand what I mean. From a organizational perspective, as always, please ask questions, any questions that come to mind during the talk, and park them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get our speakers to answer as many as we can. And again, as I always like to say at the start of these, the whole point of this is interaction and asking good questions, so do not be shy. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Maureen Monaghan from the Children's National Research Institute. Her award is an Accelerator Award, and her presentation is entitled Preparing Adolescents and Young Adults for the Transition from Pediatric to Adult Diabetes Care. Maureen, please.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. Just going to go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see that, but let me know if it doesn't advance or we run into any problems. So thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the Pathway Program and the American Diabetes Association for allowing me to present a little bit of my work today. As Dr. Newgard mentioned, I'm a faculty member at Children's National Hospital and George Washington University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C., and I am a behavioral researcher and a psychologist. And so I work directly with youth, adolescents, young adults with type 1 diabetes, and I'm excited to talk a little bit today about my Pathway Accelerator project, which is looking at a behavioral intervention to promote type 1 diabetes management and health communication and advocacy skills across the transition from pediatric to adult diabetes care. I know this is a research talk, but I'm also a clinician, and working directly with our adolescent and young adult stakeholders, I often find that it's helpful to give a pretty brief case example at the outset, just to remind everyone of some of the developmental opportunities and challenges that come along with diabetes management during adolescence and young adulthood. So this is John. He's a 22-year-old male who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 13 years of age. His most recent A1C was 8.7%. As with most of the young adults with whom we work, he is quite busy. He's enrolled part-time at a local community college. He's also working as a cook at a senior living facility, which is a somewhat inflexible job that requires him to be in person for his full shifts. He was admitted to our pediatric emergency department for DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, due to running out of insulin. So he was discharged from our pediatric diabetes care program when he was 21 years old, but unfortunately he was not able to successfully make an appointment with an adult diabetes care provider. He had challenges finding a provider that had availability to work with his schedule and accepted his insurance. And at the time he showed up in our emergency department, he hadn't seen any diabetes care professional for the past 10 months. But he wasn't able to get any refills for his insulin without scheduling an appointment. He was quite busy juggling school, a busy and flexible full-time job. He was living with a roommate and hadn't been able to prioritize getting an appointment for adult diabetes care and had to come back to our pediatric program. So I think this highlights some of the developmental transitions and challenges that occur in adolescence and young adulthood, particularly thinking about diabetes management. If we all think back to our own periods of young adulthood, this is certainly a time of a lot of growth and change, often experiencing changes in education, in employment, in peer relationships, and intimate relationships, in relationships with parents. And this is also a time where there's significant changes that occur in medical care. So young adults receive their diabetes care typically in a pediatric program, but must transition to a new adult-focused diabetes program sometime during this developmental period. And there's also changes in expectations for how they participate in their diabetes care, needing to be more independent in terms of sharing diabetes information, needs, and responsibilities with their healthcare providers. We also know this is really an important time for opportunity, and the skills that our young adults develop for diabetes self-care now can really initiate a trajectory of successful health into adulthood. Most of us who work with adolescent and young adult patients are pretty familiar with these data from the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange that are looking at A1C levels across a cross-section of patients in the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange, from young children all the way through older adults. And the peak A1C typically is occurring right around this period of transition from pediatric to adult diabetes care, with an average A1C of 9.2% at age 19 from these data in 2015. The Type 1 Diabetes Exchange looked at these data again in 2019 to see if perhaps there were any changes in terms of glycemic control across development, and similarly found that this young adult period between the ages of about 17 through 23 is really the highest period of risk for diabetes care. We found this in some of our own samples as well. So we certainly have looked at diabetes self-care behaviors in young adults in a few different ways. One study that we published in 2013, similar to these data from the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange, found that in a community recruited sample of young adults, only 19% of young adults were meeting the recommended target for glycemic control of an A1C below 7%. And we did some extensive daily diary interviews looking at things like glucose monitoring, nutrition, physical activity, BMI, body mass index, and found that across all of these domains of diabetes self-care, only 8% of our sample were meeting recommended levels of diabetes care in these key domains. So certainly showing that there are some opportunities to be able to work with our adolescent and young adult patients in some of these self-care behaviors. And again, my Pathway project is really trying to follow young adults from pediatric care to adult diabetes care. And so I wanted to just share a little bit about some of the risks and challenges that can happen during this period. So as I mentioned in the prior slide, this rise in A1C corresponds with this period of transition to adult diabetes care, suggesting, as we know, that transition can be a challenging and disruptive process. When we look at engagement with diabetes care, it's really essential for transition readiness, but there's certainly challenges that occur, and gaps in transition, or gaps in establishing care in the adult care system, are fairly common. So up to 25% of young adults have a gap of 6 months when they're transferring from pediatric to adult diabetes care, and 10% have a gap of over a year. There's certainly a number of different points of intervention that reviews by my group and others have looked at, including supporting patients and self-management skills and engagement and shared decision-making, supporting healthcare professionals in terms of identifying developmental needs and facilitating that referral and communication process from pediatric to adult care, and policy level changes looking at things like access and health insurance and cost. But some of my preliminary work has really tried to focus in on key modifiable behaviors in the pediatric care setting that we can really intervene upon, with the hope of promoting a successful launch and landing in adult diabetes care. This is a model that some collaborators and I had developed 2013 that's really guided a lot of our work in looking at the interactions that happen in the context of routine diabetes care and how that can influence that transition process. So on the left side of this diagram, we have some of the key aspects of pediatric care, looking specifically at those communication interactions. So having opportunities for developmentally appropriate communication, increasing young adult involvement in decision-making, while they're also increasing responsibility for diabetes care and transition readiness skills, with the hope that intervening in the pediatric setting will lead to successful outcomes in adult care, including high quality engagement and communication with providers, active involvement in decision-making, improved diabetes outcomes, and that commitment to medical care, so fewer gaps in care and greater engagement. And so why is this interaction or communication aspect important? When we think about health communication, it's really verbal and nonverbal exchange of information with healthcare providers about health conditions and factors associated with their management. And it's seen as one of the key skills for preparation for adult diabetes care. National policy statements on transition from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Diabetes Association really highlight these communication skills as a critical component of transition readiness, and patient difficulties with advocacy or communication are viewed by healthcare professionals as one of the barriers to successful transition to adult care. And we know from some of the literature, particularly with adults with type 2 diabetes, that high quality patient-provider communication can predict increased engagement in diabetes self-management, accounting for about 21% of the variance. And that when patient-provider communication is poor, there's about a 19% higher risk of non-adherence. So that relationship, engagement, and communication with the healthcare professional is really integral in terms of diabetes self-management. There's also been some work looking at healthcare provider behaviors in pediatric diabetes care, work by Kroom, Kakavale, and others that have found that high quality communication is associated with improved patient outcomes for diabetes self-management, self-efficacy, or their confidence in managing diabetes, and overall satisfaction with healthcare. But we know that the patient contributions to healthcare have been relatively understudied. Some of my earlier work has really looked at descriptive ways to quantify and qualify communication with healthcare providers. So we've been able to record medical visits with adolescents and young adults with type 1 diabetes. Some of this work was looking at a broader age range of about age 16 to 20, and really look at the content and quality of the communication experiences. And we have found from our audio recording and coding of medical visits that healthcare professional talk outnumbers adolescent and young adult talk at about a 3-to-1 ratio. The key development for adolescents and young adults, such as transition to adult diabetes care, substance use, sexual health, are infrequently discussed. One of the manuscripts from this data set that we published last year looked at discussions of substance use as a risk behavior with specific implications for diabetes management. And when we looked at the rates of substance use, we had over 40% of this sample of adolescents and young adults ages 16 to 20 reporting some substance use within the past 30 days, whether that was alcohol, nicotine, or another substance, but only about 8% of the clinic visits actually had a direct discussion of substance use and diabetes care. And so showing that there's some opportunity to be able to look at the content that is discussed. We also have found that higher quality communication and care, like encouraging questions and having choices for diabetes management, is associated with better type 1 diabetes management outcomes and better glycemic control. So all of this really helps us focus on some of these key interactions to promote self-management behaviors across the transition to diabetes care. As a patient-oriented researcher, I'm also constantly going back to our key young adult stakeholders and getting their perspective. This is some early qualitative work where we interviewed 20 adolescents and young adults about their health communication preferences and experiences in diabetes care. The key themes are presented here, but overall, our adolescent and young adult stakeholders reported that they really valued warm and supportive relationships with their healthcare providers. They liked a straightforward style. They reported some challenges with communication when glycemic control was elevated. So when they had an out of range A1C level, they felt that that really negatively impacted interactions in the visit. They appreciated support for autonomy and direct communication about their diabetes care, setting boundaries for parental involvement in care, some comfort with disclosure, but really reported that they preferred healthcare providers raise some of these risky topics that they were comfortable discussing, things like substance use and transition and sexual health, but didn't always know how to raise those topics in the context of care. And certainly changing healthcare providers, even in a pediatric setting, was associated with more communication challenges. So again, really informing some of the work that we have that I'll talk about now in the intervention space. So prior to the start of the trial for the Pathway Award, I did a proof of concept study that really took a lot of this literature from adolescent and young adult development, health communication, transition challenges, and some of the key descriptive work that we've done in our samples to engage some young adult stakeholders in a co-design process to really look at a behavioral intervention that can support transition readiness for adolescents and young adults with diabetes. And so we have what we call our our PrEP-DC intervention, prepare, reflect, and engage with providers for diabetes care. For this proof of concept study, we targeted adolescents and young adults with type 1 diabetes with the goal of improving health communication to facilitate successful transition from pediatric to adult diabetes care. Because this was a non-randomized small proof of concept trial, we were not able to follow patients into adult care, but we're really looking at skills that we could augment or enhance while they were in pediatric care. We recruited 16 adolescents and young adults between the ages of 17 and 21 with a relatively diverse sample of youth that were high school, college, or employed, relatively diverse in terms of racial and ethnic background, and gender, about 50% female. We developed a 2-session behavioral intervention that was delivered by phone or video conference and supported by text messaging that really focused on some of these key skills and challenges that had been raised in our descriptive work. So looking at communication preferences and effective communication with healthcare providers, making the most out of clinic visits, disclosure of difficult or sensitive topics, and promoting diabetes self-management behaviors. And we supported this content with text messaging. For this proof of concept, again, this was a pre-post study where we looked across 2 clinic visits, so approximately 4 months. We did see some signals of change in our key outcomes. So A1C did not change. The mean A1C at baseline was 9.87%, and it was 10.8% at follow-up, so that's relatively stable. We saw a significant decrease in depressive symptoms, an increase in skills related to healthcare navigation and health behaviors associated with transition readiness, and the IBDC is the independent behaviors during consultation. So our healthcare providers were rating these young adults as engaging in more independent and engaged behaviors in their clinic visit. So these were promising and allowed us to circle back to some of our key stakeholders. So we engaged adolescents and young adults, both who had participated in this proof of concept and had not, in an extensive review of these pilot materials and content and recommendations and themes. And they gave us some really good ideas for what was really helpful for them and what we really needed to just developmentally look at and make sure we were targeting this young adult age group with content that was really relevant for them. But it was great to have their feedback as we refined our aims. And this led us to where we are now, which is through this Pathway Award, evaluating a randomized trial of our PrEP-DC intervention, where we're able to look at feasibility and preliminary efficacy of this intervention for improving health communication across the transition from pediatric to adult diabetes care. And we're following these young adults into adult diabetes care and looking at moderators of intervention impact. For the intervention that we're evaluating, we have 3 sessions that are delivered all via telemedicine that focus on communication preferences and experiences. We've added in 1 session with a certified diabetes care and education specialist that really focuses on downloading, reviewing, and problem solving with glucose data, which is something that's seen as a key skill for entering adult diabetes care, and also something that young adults really appreciate, that guidance on how to do that more independently. And then we have a specific session on transition care planning and the steps that they need to take to be able to identify and secure an adult diabetes care provider. This is supported by our text messages 3 times a week and support for glucose data downloading and review. Lucky for us, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to continue delivering all of this intervention content because it really is all delivered via video conferencing and text messaging. And we've gotten some great satisfaction data so far. We don't have outcomes yet. We're still recruiting our sample with behavioral intervention trials. It certainly can take a while to recruit and follow our participants for up to 18 months into adult diabetes care. But I did want to present a few preliminary ways that we've been looking at the data. So we have spent a lot of time looking at how we're coding communication between our adolescents, young adults, and their healthcare providers. And we have been guided by the literature, some existing coding frameworks, and an expert consultant in how we can really code not just content of what is discussed in clinic visits, but also these quality of interactions and be able to look at changes in this over time. So these are some initial baseline data. This is still very preliminary, where we coded some of our baseline visits, but started to look at key domains that we are interested in terms of our healthcare provider interactions, like preparation, engagement, disclosure, and we're already really able to see the reciprocal nature of health communication. So higher levels of healthcare providers' supportive communication is associated with greater adolescent and young adult engagement and preparation. We also see education on the healthcare provider side associated with adolescent and young adult preparation for clinic visits. And so this, in addition to some of the content that we're looking at, will really give us some really tangible ways that we can support communication and care for our adolescents and young adults with type 1 diabetes. One of the most exciting things about this work is really having the opportunity to learn from our young adults about their transition experiences. We really rely on our stakeholders to identify the skills and resources that they find most helpful as they prepare for adult diabetes care and what challenges they've encountered. We're able to do extensive exit interviews with participants at the end of their experiences and learn about what the transition process was like for them and what has been really helpful for them, like communication planning, extra structured time with our certified diabetes education and care specialists, and thinking about things like risky behaviors, alcohol and drugs, and how they might want to bring that up in the context of their diabetes management and care. Of course, we have been impacted by COVID-19 over this past year, and I think that having the ability to work with adolescents and young adults during the COVID-19 pandemic has really been important as we're understanding the impact of the pandemic on their transition and on their diabetes self-management. We have been able to augment our questionnaires to ask about COVID experiences, including the transition to adult diabetes care and new ways we can support young adults during this challenging time. And we certainly have heard about more transition challenges during this period, difficulties with identifying new adult care providers, particularly if practices aren't taking on new patients as telemedicine, particularly early in the pandemic, difficulties potentially accessing medical care, and the impact that it's also had on scheduling, nutrition, behavior. So a lot of really rich information about ways that we can translate some of these findings into clinical care initiatives. We're presenting a little bit of this COVID-19 impact at ADA scientific sessions as a poster, both the qualitative, and we have some quantitative data from our young adults just on the impact that they've experienced both on their diabetes care and also their mood. And we have both negative and positive domains, but we certainly are finding at least 25% of our sample, about 55 young adults who answered these survey questions, reported that COVID-19 has made type 1 diabetes management harder for them. We have about 25% who report worrying about accessing supplies, over 20% worried about having less access to their medical team, and over 35% reported experiencing more blood glucose variability, at least some of the time, that they directly related to changes with the pandemic. Similarly, in terms of mood, we have a significant percentage of our sample reporting more anxiety, more variability in their mood, more worry about their health, so the vulnerability that comes with type 1 diabetes during the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, certainly changes in behavior and lots of impact that we've been able to capture in terms of school, education, employment setting. We're just starting to look over time, but we're also finding that when young adults have repeated our measures, that they're reporting more impact in terms of diabetes management and more challenges with care as the pandemic goes on. So I think that while it was not an original intent of this study, offers a lot of really interesting opportunities to look at ways that we can support young adults during and in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that was a little bit of the work that we've done with adolescents and young adults, just setting the stage and some of the ongoing intervention work that we have. I'd like to really thank the Pathway to Stop Diabetes program and the American Diabetes Association, Dr. Barbara Anderson, who's been a mentor and great support for this work, and of course, a lot of the colleagues and collaborators who have worked with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maureen. As I think you know, a lot of your audience here are wet lab scientists, but yes. I think you made this really clear and accessible. So thank you very much for doing that. I found your data about the impact of COVID at the end here to be really interesting. And I was wondering, as you were showing things like increase in moodiness and anxiety in your T1D, younger subjects, what do you think that you would see the same trends in those kinds of variables in a non-type 1 diabetic population, or do you think it's magnified in the T1D subjects that you're studying?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I know that there has been a lot of literature coming out in general psychology that shows young adults really are experiencing, in general, more anxiety, depression symptoms, moodiness, substance use during the pandemic. So I do think that there is a universality of some of those experiences. I think what we were really able to capture is that extra layer of health anxiety on top of this, that there is the challenges of thinking about managing a chronic condition in the context of worry about getting sick or vulnerability. And I do think that that will add to the experiences of anxiety. And so we have both general anxiety and health anxiety. And I think that the health anxiety component is fairly unique to this sample. But certainly all of our participants are sharing changes that they've experienced in terms of education, challenges with employment, reduced hours, family concerns that are more universal as well.
Thanks. I don't see anything in the chat. Barbara Anderson, maybe you can make a comment or ask a question in this area of your expertise. I think you've mentored well. That would be my conclusion.
Well, I must say, Maureen is just a delightful young investigator to work with. And the research that she's doing is just filling such a big gap in terms of our knowledge of the lifespan trajectory of people with type 1 diabetes. We have lots of excellent empirical work on young adults, on adolescents, and then we have a lot of great studies of adults and older adults, and those developmental periods. But this critical vulnerable gap is something that many researchers have just stayed away from, and I think it just reflects this bifurcated culture we have in healthcare in the United States. We have pediatric care and we have adult care. It's interesting, when I travel internationally, this is not a universal problem. In our colleagues from Scandinavian countries, where they don't have this pediatric adult care, their 18 to 24-year-olds don't have any of these transition anxieties. So Maureen has really hit a very universal, but particularly American healthcare problem for our group of people with type 1 diabetes. So I think she's doing cutting edge work, and it's just wonderful that she was the first behavioral scientist to be supported by the Pathway program. I'm just really proud of that.
Thank you. That's great. That's great perspective. Anybody else want to ask a verbal question before we move on? Anybody want to blurt something out? Okay, if not, I want to thank Maureen for, like I said, really clear
one thing, and kind of really very much outside of my area of expertise. I think this is such an important problem to solve, and just working in basic science and in type 1 diabetes, I've heard so many stories about this, of people going off to college and kids even dying in this kind of transition period, and it's just horrible. And I do wonder whether, it seems to be really, as Barbara mentioned, a policy problem. And I do wonder whether, in addition to many other issues, whether, with the new administration, this new families program, whether there's, opportunity to address this, really, really important concern. But thank you for this wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I do think that is really an important point, and tried to highlight that we're looking at modifiable targets, but there's certainly a lot that can be done at the healthcare systems level as well. And the Affordable Care Act tried to address some of these challenges with extended insurance coverage through age 26 and some more safety net supports, but there's certainly a lot more that can be done in terms of portability of medical records, better handoffs, and less division in terms of insurance companies and things like this that can make it challenging to secure care. So thank you. And thank you everyone for your time.
From a policy point of view, I think your question, raises for all of us the awareness that with all the technological changes that we have in the care of type 1 diabetes now, CGM, new hybrid closed loop systems, we have a lot of new technology, but what's happening to average A1Cs of young adults?
They're getting worse.
They're not improving. So technology, I mean, this is such a great point. I think technology is not the answer. It is probably more things like policy, changing the culture of medicine, learning how adult endocrinologists and pediatric endocrinologists can partner better, you know, how we can get more teams involved in adult care. You know, our pediatric folks have social workers, they have dietitians, they have nurse educators, they have psychologists, they often have psychologists, not always, but it's a community, it's a village in pediatric care. And adult care, it's pretty lonely if you're not have any preparation for it. So I think the policy issue is just really important.
Thank you for that comment. I think we'll need to move on to our second lecture, which, as I told you, is also very translational, as Maureen's lecture was, but in a completely different way. Our speaker here is Wolfgang Peti from the Yukon Health System. He is a visionary award winner given to senior scientists that we tried to lure from other fields into diabetes. And he has finished his award period, so he's now officially a Pathway alum. So really excited to see the fruits of the labor, fruits of the investment of this award. And his talk is going to be about sequence dynamic structure conservation to develop novel routes for diabetes drug design. Wolfgang, please. You're on mute, buddy. Yeah, okay. Okay.
I hope now everything is working.
Now everything's on.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as Christopher said, that's completely correct. I retired about 3 years ago, not from science, but from the support for the ADA. But we're still working on it because we got some really nice data, and some of the projects, as you know, in your lab take more than 4 years or 5 years. They take 10, 15, or even 20 years. So I think this is where we're going with this project here. And I'm especially excited that I see a number of folks that got awards when I was still active. I see Celine, Philip, Stephen, and another couple of ones, and remember the great meetings that we had at the ADA and really talked about science in a very nice way, and other things as well. So let me tell you what we have done over the last couple of years and months. And this is unpublished work. It's just under review in Science, so we're quite excited about that and hope have our fingers crossed that we get it through. So we were really, for a long time, we were working on a variety of proteins that have been previously assigned to being undruggable targets. So this doesn't mean that they are not identified or important drug targets, but they were really difficult to target. And one of those is protein phosphatase 1, or PTP1B. As you know, that's the enzyme that is necessary to dephosphorylate the insulin receptor, specifically reduce the activity of the kinase domain of the insulin receptor, and thus changing the signaling outcome of insulin signaling. So it has key roles and very highly qualified roles in diabetes as well as cancer. But despite the fact that people work on designing a highly specific drug for at least 20, 25 years, no approved specific inhibitor has been found. And we have worked on this target for a long time. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is twofold. Number one is, as you can see, the whole family of these tyrosine phosphatases have a highly conserved structures. And that's very typical for a large array of enzymes. They all basically look the same, as they belong to the same family here. And moreover, the active site, which tries the catalytic function, which makes the chemistry, is nearly 100% conserved. And you can see that here very nicely, is that all the parts of the protein that is necessary for the chemistry to happen is nearly identical or highly identical there, and thus the chemistry is working the same. This is highlighted here is the PTP loop where the active site is on the enzyme. And I highlight that here because I will use that in the future. And we work on designing drugs against the varieties of these enzymes. We have a huge effort going on in SHIP2 against cancer, and we used on PTP1B. And so nothing is working at this point here, despite the fact that actually there's a lot of funding available, which makes it even more frustrating. But the one thing that you have to keep in mind is the following thing. I talked about the chemistry is the same, but what is different is the speed that the chemistry is processed. And that is a clear difference between those enzymes. For instance, I have a bacterial homologue. This is YOP-H from Yersinia pestis, which is 20 times more active. Other homologues are only 2 or 3 times more active or 5 times more active. So despite the fact that they use the same chemistry, they have dramatically different levels of activity. And nobody understands where that is coming from. So if you understand where that's coming from, you find a novel route of maybe finding a way to drug those specifically. So what is the idea? Why don't we understand that? Well, it is clear that every protein or every enzyme has a sequence, and we know that the sequence defines the structure, and we know that the structure defines the function. In case of our tyrosine phosphatase here, we know that it hydrolyzes the phosphate from the substrate and allows for this reaction to occur. What has been clear over the last couple of years is that it's not just the structure that is the key driving force to gain the function, but it's often also the dynamics of the protein. How are things moving? In a very primitive way for this enzyme, it was thought that this loop here, which is called the WPD loop, can confirm 2 conformation, and that the speed of this loop opening is actually driving that. And I will show you that this is a much more too primitive way of looking at it, and really led to the fact is that we overlooked how the enzyme is actually working and how we can actually change its inhibition. So what we laid out to do is let's figure out how it's really working. And so what we did is we collaborated with Kristen Lindelof Larsen at the University of Copenhagen, who he and a number of other groups have over the last maybe 3, 4, 5 years developed technologies that allow us to look at coevolution at a structural domain level. So that has been done before, that you look at coevolution just on a sequence level. But the question is, could you go a step further and actually look at coevolution of conserved conformation, or even think about possibly conserved dynamics if something like this exists, and then understand how to modulate the function? That's exactly what we did for PTP1B. So for that, we used about 4,400 sequences from a variety of species. And the first thing that you'd have to do is you qualify how good this data is. And what we did is we formed a quality score. So this is PTP1B that I showed you here. And the first quality score of our bioinformatics study was basically getting us a Q of 4. And that means we have 4 conserved domains. Let's just see how good that is actually working. So the first thing it identified was alpha 1 prime, alpha 2 prime, this N-terminal domain here. And that right now has no function assigned. There's a paper that we submitted is actually necessary for substrate recruitment. So it does actually have a function. It identified the catalytic core. It identified an area here of beta, a large beta sheet here that we know is important for transmission of allosteric function in the protein, as well as it identified the allosteric site. So this was fantastic because the 4 most important and diverse functional domains of PTP1B were snap identified in a couple of calculations. So that was really promising. So what we did is we jumped forward and looked at what can we learn if we divide it up more? Is there more information to learn? And that was really the case. So we jumped forward to a Q of 6, where we have 6 domains. And I don't have the time to go into detail here, but what we identified is one functional evolutionary domain that is centered around F225. F225 is right next to the PTP loop here, that is the catalytic active center, but involves a large variety of other areas here. So what we said is, well, that's really interesting. Maybe that's the center of evolution within the protein, and it can actually tell us something how that protein is actually working. So what we do in this case here, we look is, where is that residue? It's an alpha 4 in a huge hydrophobic cluster that is centered around alpha helix 3, loop 14, there's L2, and others here. And then we can look what are the other residues that are actually can be substituted for this. And the highest substitution of that in the coevolution of these enzymes is actually a tyrosine. So we can look at the activity, and much to our surprise here, we found that this enzyme is suddenly twice as active. And that is a function that purely is a Kcat function. Km stays the same. So you have a residue that is 5 or 6 angstrom away from the active site and changes suddenly the catalytic activity without changing how the substrate or the chemistry is done. So that was good. So we looked at coevolution because that was the name of the game that we had there. And we identified that the residues that co-involved the most were these two residues on helix alpha 3, 195 and 199. And again, when we looked at the activity, they hugely increased. Now suddenly we have an enzyme that is 4-fold more active, purely driven by Kcat and not Km. And this is residues that are 15 angstroms away from the active site. So this is something you will not find in the literature right now in any way or form. So this was really exciting for us that we can look into that and actually identify that in a fairly easy and straightforward way, quite far away from the active site, solely Kcat driven. Okay, that was really interesting. And some people ask me 3 or 4-fold increase, is that actually really that important? It's huge. If you think on a statistical way in a cellular context, the 3-fold increase would change the complete signaling outcome of any signaling pathway that you have. Much more primitive, think of a tripling of your salary and you will say it is a big effect. And the question was, what is the mechanism of this activation? I don't have the time to show you. We looked, is it allosteric, is it structure, or is it the dynamics? And all I can tell you, it's the dynamics, and I show you why. So we use biomolecular NMR spectroscopy to extract that here. What I do very quickly here is compare the spectrum, which is a 50N correlation spectrum, which correlates the chemical shift, excuse me, of the NH backbone residues of PTP1B and the mutant F225 with the proton chemical shift. And what you can see here is, despite the fact that there's a single mutant here, there's a dramatic amount of changes. The blue peaks don't overlay with the black peaks. I can show you that better when I compare these chemical shift changes along the residue number here. And you can see all these changes displayed here as a change in these chemical shift values here. The cool thing is they were identical with the bioinformatically predicted evolutionary domain. We can go forward and do that for this even more active mutant, and we get the same outcome here. So this is all centered around to this predicted evolutionary domain. And the one thing that really was highlighted here is that this L14 loop is also part of this chemical shift perturbation mapping and the AD domain. Why is that important? Well, it is important because L14, as I said, is part of this ED, but specifically L204, the residue leucine 204, is the most highly conserved residue in PTP1B that is not in a secondary structure element. Nobody understood why this thing was so highly conserved. So what we did is, again, we mutated that to 204A variant. And what I can see here is that this is also a 2-fold increase in activity. So something in a loop nearly 20 angstroms away from the active side, boom, suddenly has a 2-fold increase in activity. And again, it's a pure Kcat event, nothing to do with Km. Okay, so this was quite staggering. So in order to understand that, we again used NMR spectroscopy. What do we have to do here? Well, I can show you here. This is your turnover rate. So these enzymes work in about 50 or 23 times per second. So what we have to look is at the millisecond or microsecond timescale of the enzyme dynamics To do that, we use the technique called constant time CPMG relaxation dispersion techniques. And specifically here, we use it on the side chains. And the reporters we use is isoleucine, leucine, and valine. And in our case, we are lucky because in PTP1B, these are exceedingly well distributed. So we get readouts from a lot of areas within PTP1B. And this is just to show you the data and that we can do it also in L204A that we have here. So what is the outcome? Well, the outcome is very simple. The outcome is that in wild-type PTP1B, as well as the mutant, the whole protein is moving at a rate of about 3,600 times or 3,900 times. What it simply means is that enzyme is wobbling quite fast in solution. Nothing surprising here. So then we said, well, we need to change that and actually look what is happening during catalytic reaction. What is happening there is that something is bound to the active site. Something is blocking the active site and something is changing there. In this case here, we used an inhibitor called TCS401. When you add the inhibitor, you can see a huge change in the type of spectra that we can record due to the fact that the environment of the active site is changed, and this is happening. Then we can measure again this type of dynamics that I told you before. And what we see here immediately, and that's done for wild type PTP first, is that in this active site inhibited form of PTP1B, there is the dynamics is reduced into two groups. A group that is around the active site, as well as a group that is just behind the active site here. What does it mean? Well, this is a dramatic change in intermediate timescale dynamics. So when you go from the free form to the active site bound form, we change by about 7-fold. Everything slows down. And what is the important information to take away from this is that when we bind something to the active site, something is changing, the WPD loop is folding, but it does not do so in an independent way, but rather all the areas around the active site do that together, as I show you here or in the front view. So all these motions are synchronized suddenly, and they are synchronized at a much lower speed that allows for the chemistry to happen. Okay, so for the last 30 years, every drug design was focused around that there's a single movement of the WPD loop, but now suddenly we know if we block some of the movements of the other loops, we probably get to the same effect, allowing you to look at the much other areas as well. But then we looked at this group 2 areas that is actually quite far away from the active site. Again, this is 20 angstroms away from the active site. And the whole second group here, which is a statistically ranked group here, is again slowed down by about 5-fold. 5-fold slower than the free state of PTP1B. Interesting, but we didn't really understand what is happening, to be honest. So then we looked at L2,4A here. And right when you look at it and just compare the data for a wild-type PTP and L2,4A, quite frankly, there's not much of a difference, which is great. That means they behave pretty much similar. There's a slowing, the same group we see in PTP1B is slowed down in that mutant, as well as there's a group 2 that is highly similar or identical with that. So what is happening? Well, in the active side here, we get again the same type of slowing, but it's only about 1.2-fold different. So the active side motion is just slow for both enzymes, the wild type or the mutant enzyme. So we looked also at that second group here, and that second group was strikingly different. And it was different, and you can do the math in your head here, by exactly nearly 2-fold. And if you remember, the activity difference between the protein, wild type protein, L204 protein, is exactly 2-fold. So what we just showed here is that most likely the difference in activity, which is 20 angstroms away from the active site, is that suddenly this group of residues that is far away from the active site is moving at a higher frequency, and it's exactly a 2-fold difference in the frequency of that brings you the activity of L2,4. Let's look at this a little bit more in detail. This is the exchange that I'm talking to you. And in order to get this exchange going, we can have 2 states, a state A and a state P, and we will have this exchange process. And we can now extract from our measurements, not just the exchange frequency that I just showed to you, but also the exchange population. How much is the population of state A and state P during that exchange process? And when you have that, you can actually calculate the rates of these KAB events here. And we can do that for wild type as well as the protein. And when you then use that and compare it to the KCAT exchange rate, both are unidirectional, both are uniform, you can see they're nearly identical, showing that these group 2 residues are really the ones that really are driving the KCAT of PTP1B. So again, it's not the active site residues that really drives these enzymes. It's far away from the active site, as 20 angstroms away. So how does this work? Well, again, let's look at the enzyme. This is PTP1B. This is the active site here. This is cysteine 215. That is these key cysteine residues where your chemistry is happening in order to allow for the hydrolysis of your substrate to happen. And this is arginine 225, all 100% conserved throughout the full family of the protein that is necessary in order to allow for these reactions to happen, all on alpha helix 4. So residues of group 2 are in beta strand 11 and alpha helix 4 that are flanking this catalytically critical PTP loop. But they're also on other sides of the equation. They're actually on beta strand 3 and beta strand 4. And those two beta strands are actually flanking the beta strand 11 and forming cradling alpha helix 4 from the bottom. We have also identified two leucines that have the same frequencies that are actually surrounding. These are the leucines that surround F225, which was the starting point of our analysis, again, cradling alpha helix 4, and other residues on alpha helix 6 and 5 that do the same cradling here. So what was the key part here is, well, when we mutate alpha, now 205A is, we allow the motions of alpha helix 4 to occur at a higher frequency as we give it more freedom to move. And we believe what we just showed here is that there's the movement of alpha helix 4 that goes forward and backwards is the key part of driving the enzymatic function of this type of family of enzymes. So this was quite exciting. But then we went back and said, like, well, I just told you that the family of enzyme is moving, is using the same mechanism of chemistry, but they have these different frequencies. Let's look at the conservation of these residues that drive the frequencies. So we first looked at the conservation of human PTPs on helices alpha 3 and alpha 4. So I just told you these are not important. They're not conserved and they don't drive the catalytic turnover. And now we look at the conservation of these cradling beta sheets that I showed you before, beta 3, 4, and 11. And you can see that these are all highly conserved and are forming the baseline for these motions that are necessary and sufficient for the catalytic reaction of PTP1B and other PTPs. And now go on and go back to this Yersinia pestis enzyme that works the same way, but is 20 times faster. What you can see here is this cradling on alpha street beta 4, 3, and 10, and 11 that I showed just for is also 100% conserved between bacterial and human enzymes. However, the rigidity is completely different because something like 204 and other residue are mutated, allowing for a much faster movement of this alpha helix 4 here. So what I really showed you here is that there's not just conservation between sequence, structure, and function that Anderson has shown and that we believe strongly into it. This is why we look at PDBs, compare the structures, and know the function of these proteins. But much moreover, there is a conservation between sequence, dynamics, and function. And it's actually the dynamics that drives the catalytic function of these enzymes here. And why is that important is because we know now there are other areas of the enzymes, 20 angstrom or 25 angstrom away, that have nothing to do with allostery that can be fully targeted with small molecules or other ways to either increase or decrease the speed of an enzyme. So what we can do is actually now design small molecules that can go in both ways. And that is actually something that we are actively doing, much less in my lab, but in companies that we have formed around that ideas. And then we are moving forward for this type of enzyme as well as a variety of other enzymes. With that, I wanted to show you who has done the work. And actually, you probably wouldn't, it's hard to believe, but the key work on this was driven by a single grad student, Christiana here, that was at the beginning of the work, she was still smiling. She was not always smiling during the work because it was a tremendous amount of work, but she pulled it through. And now she is more than smiling again because this is really fantastic. I highlighted was collaboration with a number of people. Sentil was working on it. Michael Clarkson was essential. Rebecca Page was essential. I mentioned Danielle and Creston during the talk here. And so these are the people that are really drove the work forward and allowed us to make that happen. The one thing that I want to do here is mentioning here is I also chair of the department here is, and I have an open tenure track faculty position in my department as announced here that looks actually at signaling, cellular signaling events. And so if anybody knows somebody who would be highly qualified for that, I kind of encourage you to let them apply for that position. Is actually a great working environment that we have here at UConn Health. I've been at 3 places, but that's certainly the best working environment I've seen. And there's a lot of faculty here for a long time. And it's a very, very supportive environment that we have here, right next to a hospital, about 30 feet away from where the hospital starts, including a Starbucks. And so there's a lot of opportunity here. So if you know somebody that's interesting, want to talk about it, please just email me or let me know. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you. That was remarkable. Thank you very much. Tour de force. So please chime in, folks, on the chat if you'd like. But I'll just start out briefly. So this beta sheet cradle that you speak of, which it was a little bit counterintuitive as being the domain of the protein that's really driving its catalytic function. How do you interfere with that movement using small molecules? Is there a particular strategy to try to do that?
So,
because the goal is to inhibit this phosphatase, right?
Yes, you can. Some of these phosphatases you want to inhibit. Some of the phosphatases you actually want to accelerate.
Right.
Because both those ways, for some serine phosphatases, acceleration would be critical, especially in cancer and in other areas. So activation can be a very, very effective way too. And this is the exciting thing because we can go in both ways. Okay, so this is not just one way, but yeah, in PTPs, we want to slow them down and find a way. For instance, in TCPTP, we want to activate it again. So this is the way that we do it. How we specifically do it, we have also computational mechanism how to predict areas that we can modulate these novel areas that are far away from the active site.
Right.
So what that allows us to do is now find areas that we can modify by either small molecules or other ways to really increase the speed of the enzyme here. Can't really describe that in too much detail at this point, but it seems like to be working in exactly the way how you think it could be working.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to jump in verbally if you wish. I don't see anything in the chat. Anything from our insulin action, insulin signaling colleagues?
Hi,
Yeah, Barbara, thank you.
Barbara. Yeah, so really interesting work.
Yeah.
You know, PTP1B has been such a good candidate for treating insulin resistance. And I know you're aware, and we've talked at the ADA meetings about how many companies have tried working on it and decided it was not druggable. Now with these insights that you have, do you think it is druggable? I mean, you know, could we look forward to a PTP1B inhibitor of some sort?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Yeah, good seeing you again. Yes, short answer is yes. That's our hope, but it will be completely different because we don't use allostery like it has been before. I mean, that was the first part that a lot of people looked at. We don't use any of the active side, but sort of like what you can think here is because we identified how it's really working, you only have to block the movement of alpha helix 4. So that's the only thing that you have to do. And we have seen for other enzymes that there's a small area that you need to block or allow to swing faster to actually change that. And there's quite a variety of ways how you can actually achieve that. There's ways where you can make, for instance, alpha helix heavier. Okay, so that would be an idea because then suddenly the movement slows down. Okay, because there's momentum change that you have there, and even at the atomic resolution level, that a momentum change will be actually resulting in a slower KCAT in some aspect. So that's a way how to modify something, or maybe rigidify it in some way or form that you cannot move at all, or to find a small molecule that really wedges somewhere in between. So there's a variety of possibilities that you now suddenly have to really slow things down or make things faster. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to do that for PTP1B. We're specifically, the largest funding we have is actually for SHIP2. But we will hopefully do that for PTP1B at one point too.
Is there specificity in that sort of approach?
Yeah, I was worried about that too, because it is a conserved motion that you have here. But yeah, we can make it specific because the key part is that the sequence, while the motion is conserved, the sequence of alpha helix 4 is actually not conserved because there's no need of that conservation. So in principle, that plays in your favor because you are now targeting an area that has a conserved motion, but the residues are not conserved. Because the conserved residues are on the bottom that allow for the motion to happen, but the backside of alpha 4 is not conserved at all. So that's actually really the awesome, that one awesome part of that story is like, yeah, we can target something that is not conserved. I was concerned, I had the same, what you said was my first thing, but then I was like, actually, no, we are not targeting the sheet that is conserved. We're targeting alpha 4, and that's actually not conserved.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much to both Wolfgang and Maureen. As I said, very different topics.
Richard has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who does?
Richard Bergman. Richard, you're muted or something. We don't hear you.
I didn't see that.
Yeah, he raised his hand.
Oh, Rich? No, still not coming through, Rich.
Type it in the chat. Type it in the chat, Richard.
Okay. I think we'll have to be respectful of people's time. We're over time a little bit. And really want to thank Wolfgang and Maureen. Very different talks, both really compelling. Our next session is Wednesday, June 2nd at 2 o'clock again. And we'll have Praveen Sethupathi and Sarah Tishkoff as our next speakers. Please join us. Thank you, everyone. And thank you especially to our speakers. Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you soon. Stay safe.